Today, I want to share with you a story about resilience, about the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes not just from hard work, but from carrying a heavy world on shoulders that were never meant to bear it alone. It is a story about a woman named Sarah Miller, and the day the wind finally shifted in her favor. The Arizona Territory in late August is a merciless place. It is a land where the sun doesn't just shine. It strikes the earth like a hammer against an anvil. And on this particular Tuesday, that hammer was beating down on Sarah Miller's back. The air was thick with the scent of dried sagebrush and the metallic tang of hot dust. Sarah stood on the rutted track that led to her trading post, Miller's Crossing. She was 48 years old, with hands that had once played the piano in a parlor back east. But now, those hands were calloused, cracked, and currently wrapped around the splintered spokes of a wagon wheel. The wagon was loaded heavy, with sacks of flour and feed supplies she had spent her last few dollars to procure. And the wheel, tired and dried out like everything else in this county, had slipped its rim. She shoved her shoulder against the wood, gritting her teeth. "Come on," she whispered, her voice rasping in the dry heat. Just 1 inch. She pushed until black spots danced in her vision. The wagon groaned, a heavy, wooden protest. But it didn't budge. Sarah stumbled back, gasping for air, wiping a mixture of sweat and grit from her forehead with her apron. She looked up at the sky, a vast, blinding expanse of blue that felt entirely indifferent to her struggle. In that moment, the silence of the desert wasn't peaceful. It was loud. It was a reminder of the empty chair at her dinner table. It had been 2 years since Thomas passed. 2 years of managing the ledger. 2 years of fixing fences. 2 years of sleeping with a shotgun under the bed. She missed him with an ache that had dulled but never disappeared. But standing there, knees trembling from exertion, she didn't just miss his love. She missed his strength. She missed the safety of knowing she wasn't the only thing standing between her home and the wilderness. "Lord," she breathed, the prayer slipping out before she could stop it. "I am trying to be strong, but I am so tired. Just, please, send me strength." The only answer was the wind, whistling low through the mesquite. And then, the sound of hoofbeats for a heartbeat. Hope fluttered in her chest, but as she shaded her eyes against the glare, the hope turned cold. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a pristine white horse, stepping high and proud, carrying a man who looked entirely out of place in the dust. Silas Thorne. He was the land agent for the railroad. A man who wore suits that cost more than Sarah's entire trading post. He pulled his horse to a halt 10 feet away, looking down at her from his saddle. He didn't dismount. He didn't offer a hand. He just sat there, clean and cool, watching her wipe her dirty hands on her skirt. "Mrs. Miller," he drawled, tipping his hat. It was a gesture of politeness that felt more like an insult. "Looks like you're in a bit of a bind." Sarah straightened her spine. She refused to look small in front of him. "Just a slipped rim, Mr. Thorne. I have it handled." Thorne chuckled, a dry sound like dry leaves crushing. "Do you know? Out here, things break. Wagons, fences, spirits." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the saddle horn. "My offer still stands. Sarah, the railroad pays cash. You could be back east in a month. Sewing circles, paved streets, No more wrestling with broken wheels in the dirt. This is my home, Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the shaking in her hands. It's not for sale. Not for the pennies you're offering. Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. The price goes down every week you make us wait. And this is dangerous country for a woman alone. Accidents happen. Mrs. Miller. Wheels break. Fires start. It would be a shame if something unfortunate forced your hand. The threat hung in the hot air between them, sharp and undeniable. He wasn't just predicting bad luck. He was promising it. Sarah stepped forward, clutching her apron. Good day, Mr. Thorne. He lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her land like he already owned it. Then, with a scoff, he spurred his horse. Think on it, he called back. Before the desert decides for you. He rode off, leaving her choked in a cloud of dust. Sarah coughed, waving the grit away. But the heaviness in her chest remained. She looked back at the wagon. It seemed heavier now. Impossible. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the road. She was alone. Truly, terrifyingly alone. She stepped back to the wheel, gripping the rough wood. Tears prickled her eyes hot. Angry tears. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give Thorne the satisfaction. She would move this wagon if it killed her. She heaved again, a cry of frustration tearing from her throat. Nothing. Easy. Ma'am. The voice was deep, low, and came from nowhere. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hadn't heard a horse. She hadn't heard footsteps. Standing just beyond the wagon, emerging from the settling dust of Thorne's departure, was a man. He was tall, imposingly so. He wore the dust of the road like a second skin. His clothes were a patchwork of cultures worn denim trousers tucked into knee-high moccasins, a faded calico shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His hair was dark, tied back, streaked with the gray of hard years. Sarah stepped back, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept in her pocket. I don't have any money, she stammered. The stranger didn't move closer. He raised his hands slightly, palms open. I didn't ask for any. He looked at the wagon, then back to her. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of wind and sun and long silences. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, steady, and filled with an ancient kind of sadness. There was no malice in them, only a quiet recognition of struggle. Without another word, he walked past her. He didn't ask for permission. He simply moved with a fluid, predator grace that made no sound on the hard earth. He dropped a battered canvas pack near the wheel. Step back, he murmured. Sarah hesitated, then obeyed. The stranger crouched. He didn't grunt or posture. He simply placed his shoulder under the corner of the heavy wagon bed, planted his feet, and stood up. Sarah gasped. That wagon held 300 pounds of flour and feed. She had watched 2 men struggle to lift it the previous winter. This stranger lifted it with a smooth, controlled exhale, the muscles in his back shifting under his shirt like coiled iron. Slide it, he said. His voice was strained, but steady. Sarah snapped out of her trance. She scrambled forward, grabbing the wheel. With the weight gone, she shoved it hard. It popped over the axle and settled into the groove with a solid clunk. Clear, she said. Breathless, he lowered the wagon slowly, setting it down as gently as one might set down a sleeping child. He exhaled a long breath and straightened up, rolling his shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rushed through the sagebrush, but the menacing feeling Thorne had left behind was gone, replaced by something heavier, yet safer. Grounded. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice trembling. I don't know how long I would have been out here." The stranger picked up his pack. He looked thirsty. His lips were cracked, his skin parched. "Water?" he asked. It was a singular word, devoid of demand. "Yes," Sarah said quickly. "Yes, of course. There's a pump at the house. The water is cold." He nodded once. He began to walk toward her porch, leading his own horse, a sturdy paint that looked as travel-worn as he was. Sarah walked beside him, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. "I'm Sarah Miller," she offered. He paused for a beat, looking out toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed orange into the sky. "Kele," he said. "Kele Redwolf." They reached the porch. Sarah hurried to pump a tin cup full of water. He took it, his fingers brushing hers rough skin against rough skin. He drank in long, slow gulps, then refilled the cup and poured it into his hat for his horse. Sarah watched him. He wasn't a drifter begging for scraps. He carried himself with too much dignity for that. He moved like a soldier, or perhaps a warrior who had laid down his weapons but not his vigilance. She looked at the roof of her trading post, where the shingles had been torn away by last week's storm. She had been dreading climbing up there. "Mr. Redwolf," she said. He turned, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I can't offer you much," she said, finding a courage she didn't know she had. "But I have a roof that needs fixing, and a barn that needs mucking. I can offer hot meals, a place to sleep in the loft, and fair wages." Kele looked at the roof, assessing the damage with those sharp, sad eyes. Then he looked at Sarah. He saw the trembling in her hands, the exhaustion in her posture, and perhaps the fear that Silas Thorne had planted in her heart. He didn't smile. He didn't charm. He simply nodded. "The roof first," he said quietly. "Before the rain comes." Sarah let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 2 years, as Kele Redwolf unrolled his pack on her porch steps. The sun finally dipped below the horizon. The desert was still dangerous. The debt was still real. But as the first star appeared in the twilight, Sarah realized something profound. She wasn't alone in the dark anymore. Time in the high desert is usually measured in losses. The peeling paint, the dry rot in the timber, the slow erosion of the creek bed, the fading of hope. For 2 years, Sarah Miller had watched the clock of her life tick backward, stripping away everything she and Thomas had built. But in the days that followed Kele Redwolf's arrival, the direction of time seemed to shift. It wasn't a sudden miracle. It was a slow, steady reconstruction, measured in the rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting ironwood and the groan of nails being pulled from warped boards. Sarah found herself waking up differently. For so long, the morning sun had been an adversary, signaling another day of impossible labor. Now, the dawn brought with it the sounds of industry. Before Sarah even tied her apron strings, she would hear him, the heavy, purposeful tread of boots on the hard-packed earth, the metallic clatter of the toolbox. She watched him through the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for the morning bread. Kele worked with an efficiency that was almost hypnotic. He didn't fight the land. He moved with it. When he repaired the corral fence, he didn't just patch the holes. He reinforced the posts with stones dug from the creek bed, weaving the wire tight and singing a low, guttural song under his breath that the wind carried away before Sarah could catch the melody. He was a man of few words. Their conversations were utilitarian, exchanged over the midday meal of beans and cornbread. "Roof's holding," he would say, or "horse needs shoeing," and Sarah would nod, offering him more coffee, which he accepted with a slight dip of his chin. But it was the evenings that began to change her, the transition from the blinding heat of the day to the cool, purple bruise of twilight had always been the loneliest hour. That was when the silence of the house felt heavy enough to crush her. But 4 days after Kele arrived, the silence changed. It was late afternoon. The air was cooling, smelling of pinewood sap and the dark, rich aroma of the coffee Sarah had just brewed. She walked out onto the porch, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. Kele was sitting on the bottom step, whittling a piece of cedar. He stopped when the screen door creaked. Looking up, he had washed the dust from his face and hands at the pump. His dark hair slicked back, tying it away from his sharp features. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. I thought you might want something warm. The air gets thin at night." He set the wood and knife down, standing up out of respect, a habit that seemed ingrained in him. Despite his rough appearance, he took the mug. "Thank you." "Ma'am, Sarah," she corrected gently. "Please, if you're going to save my roof, you can call me by my name." He looked at her over the rim of the cup, the steam curling around his face. "Sarah." He tested the word. It sounded different, coming from him grounded. "Serious." She sat in the rocking chair, the one Thomas used to occupy. Kele sat back down on the step, keeping a respectful distance, his back to her, watching the road. They didn't speak. In the past, silence with a stranger would have made Sarah's skin crawl with anxiety. She would have felt the need to fill the air with chatter about the weather or the price of feed. But this silence was different. It was heavy, yes, but it was a warm weight. Like a quilt, the only sounds were the crickets beginning their nightly chorus in the sagebrush, the rhythmic creak of Sarah's rocker, and the occasional sip of coffee. She watched the line of his shoulders. They were broad, tense, always ready to move, yet currently at rest. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah didn't feel the need to scan the horizon for trouble. She realized, with a jolt that nearly spilled her coffee, that she was letting him do the watching. She felt safe. It was a dangerous feeling. Safety. It made you soft. It made you hope. But as the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Sarah Miller allowed herself to close her eyes and just breathe, smelling the coffee and the sage, anchored by the presence of the silent man on the steps. But the desert, and men like Silas Thorne, do not let peace linger for long. The reality of their precarious position arrived 3 mornings later, not with a shout, but with the heartbreaking sight of destruction. Sarah woke early, intending to pick the last of the late summer tomatoes. Her vegetable garden was small, a patch of green she had coaxed from the dry earth with buckets of water carried by hand. Day after day, it was her pride. It was fresh food for the winter. When she walked around the side of the house, She dropped her basket. The garden was gone. It wasn't that animals had gotten in. No deer or coyote leaves boot prints. The tomato plants had been stomped into the dirt. Green fruit crushed into red smears against the brown earth. The squash vines were torn up by the roots and thrown against the house. But the cruelest blow was the water barrel. The large oak cask that collected the precious rainwater from the gutter lay on its side. The staves smashed in with something heavy, likely a sledgehammer. The damp earth around it mocked her weeks of water, soaking uselessly into the dust. "No," Sarah whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, no." The tears came instantly, hot and stinging. It wasn't just vegetables. It was the violation. It was the message that nothing she built, nothing she nurtured, was safe. Silas Thorne hadn't come himself, but his reach was long. He was telling her that he could take the food from her mouth and the water from her cup whenever he chose. She sank to her knees in the mud of the ruined garden, picking up a crushed tomato, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She felt small. She felt foolish for thinking a fixed roof meant she was secure. She didn't hear Kele approach, but she felt his shadow fall over her. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't offer empty platitudes like, "It will be all right," or "We can plant again." He knew, as well as she did, that the growing season was over. He crouched beside her. He didn't touch her. He seemed to sense she was too fragile for that, but his presence was a shield against the morning sun. "Thorne," Sarah choked out, wiping her eyes with a muddy hand. "He did this." Kele stood up slowly. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning. He walked to the edge of the garden, crouching low to examine the earth. He traced the deep, chaotic indentations in the soil. With long, brown fingers. "3 men," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Rode in from the North Ridge, left their horses by the wash, came in on foot." He stood and walked to the smashed barrel. He ran his hand over the splintered wood. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "Why destroy food? Why water? It's cowardly." Kele turned to face her. The sadness in his eyes had hardened into something sharp, something dangerous. "That is exactly what it is," he said. "A wolf doesn't announce his hunt. Sarah, a wolf kills to eat. A coyote kills to survive. But this," he gestured to the ruin, "this is the work of a frightened dog trying to look big. These men are cowards. They strike what cannot fight back." He walked over to her then, extending a hand. Sarah looked at it calloused, scared. "Steady." She took it. He pulled her to her feet with an effortless strength that made her feel, for a fleeting second, weightless. "Go inside," he said gently. "Wash your face. Make the coffee." "What will you do?" she asked, fear spiking in her chest. She didn't want him to ride out and get killed. "I am moving my things," he said. "Moving." Her heart dropped. "You're leaving." "No," Kele said, and the word rang like a bell. "I am moving my bedroll. I have been sleeping in the barn." Too far to hear a bootstep in the dark, he looked toward the ridge where the riders had come from. "From now on, I sleep on the porch, by the door." Sarah stared at him. He was offering himself as a living barrier between her and the dark. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. "It's not your fight." Kele looked at her, and for the first time, a small, Grim's smile touched the corner of his mouth. You gave me water when I was thirsty. Sarah, you gave me a roof. That makes it my fight. The dynamic in the house shifted after that. The air was charged with a new kind of tension, not the fear of Thorne, but the intense awareness of one another. They were no longer just employer and hired hand. They were allies in a siege. A week later, the afternoon sun was slanting through the windows of the trading post's back room, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the air. Sarah sat on a stool, her sewing basket open on her lap. Hold still, she murmured. Kele stood before her, obedient but clearly uncomfortable. He had snagged his shirt on a rusted nail while repairing the corral gate, a long, jagged tear down the side. He had tried to hide it, but Sarah had noticed. She insisted on mending it immediately. It is fine, he had grumbled. It's just a shirt. It's your only shirt. Kele, she had retorted, and I won't have you walking around looking like a scarecrow. Now, he stood, shirtless, the torn garment in her hands, while the late afternoon heat pressed into the room. Sarah threaded her needle, trying to keep her eyes on the fabric. But her gaze betrayed her. It drifted to the man standing a few feet away. She had known he was strong. She had seen him lift wagons and haul timber. But seeing him now, stripped of the loose calico shirt, she saw the map of his life written on his skin. His chest and arms were defined by hard, ropey muscle, browned deep by the sun. But it was his back that stole the breath from her lungs. As he turned slightly to look out the window, the light caught the ridges of old, silvered scars. They crisscrossed his shoulder blades, some thin and white, likely from knives or briars, others round and puckered, the telltale kiss of a bullet. But there were other marks, too, marks that looked like they came from a whip. Zara's hand froze, the needle hovering over the cloth. Kele, she breathed, the name slipping out involuntarily. He tensed. He knew what she was looking at. He didn't turn around, but his posture went rigid, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. I told you, he said, his voice rough. It is just skin. That isn't just skin, Sarah said softly. She set the shirt down on her lap. She felt a profound wave of sorrow wash over her, a grief for the pain this man had endured. Those are war marks. He turned slowly to face her. His expression was guarded, his jaw set hard. I have lived a long time, Sarah. The world leaves its mark. You were a soldier, she asked. He let out a short, bitter laugh. I was a scout. For the army. Sarah's eyes widened. An Apache scout. For the U.S. Army. She knew enough of the stories to know what a perilous, lonely existence that was, caught between two fires. I thought. He looked down at his hands, struggling for the words. I thought if I helped them, if I guided them through the canyons, I could keep the peace. I thought I could convince the soldiers to talk instead of shoot. And I thought I could convince my people that fighting was a war they could not win. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The sadness in his eyes was bottomless now. I was wrong. The army used my eyes to find camps. And then they stopped listening to my voice when I begged for mercy. And my people, he shook his head. To them, I am a ghost, a traitor. I walked the line between two worlds. Sarah, and both of them cut me. The silence that followed was thick with the tragedy of it. He was a man without a tribe, a man who had tried to save everyone and had saved no one. ending up with nothing but scars and the dust of the road. "I have no home," he said quietly. "I am just a drifter, passing through until the wind changes." Sarah stood up. The shirt slid from her lap to the floor. Forgotten. She stepped closer to him. The distance between them, usually so carefully maintained, vanished. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the scent of soap and cedar smoke on his skin. She reached out. Her hand, pale and trembling slightly, moved toward him. Kele watched her, his breath hitched in his chest. He looked like he wanted to pull away, to retreat back into his solitude. But he stayed rooted to the spot. Sarah's fingertips grazed his forearm, then rested gently on his hand. Her touch was light, but it felt electric. It was a bridge crossing a chasm that had been widening for years. "You are not a ghost, Kele Mende," she whispered. He looked down at her hand, covering his. The contrast, her softness against his roughness, seemed to stun him. She looked up into his face, her blue eyes fierce, with a sudden, undeniable clarity. "And you are not just passing through," she said. "Look at this house. Look at the fence. Look at the garden you are helping me turn back into earth. You are part of this place now." She squeezed his hand. A firm, grounding pressure. "You have a place here, Kele, as long as you want it. You are not a drifter to me." For a moment, time seemed to stop in the dusty back room of Miller's Crossing. The sounds of the desert faded away. There was only the sound of their breathing and the overwhelming realization passing between them. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a declaration of undying passion. It was something deeper. It was an anchor dropping into the sea. Kele turned his hand over, his fingers slowly interlacing with hers. His grip was tentative, as if he were holding something incredibly fragile that he was terrified of breaking. "As long as I want it," he repeated, his voice barely a murmur. "As long as you want it," Sarah affirmed. He looked at her, and the stone mask finally cracked. The lines around his eyes softened. The tension in his shoulders drained away. He looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who had finally set down a heavy pack. "Then I am not going anywhere," he said. In that quiet room, amidst the dust and the heat, the bond was sealed. It was no longer just about survival. It was no longer just about fighting Thorne. They had fallen in love. It was unspoken, unwritten, but as undeniable as the sunrise. And as Sarah picked up the shirt to finish the mending, she knew that the battle for Miller's Crossing was about to become much harder. Because now, she had something far more precious to lose. Darkness in the high desert is absolute. When the moon is hidden behind a bank of clouds, the world disappears into a void of ink and silence. It is a time when honest folks are asleep under their quilts, and when creatures of the night begin their prowl. On this particular night, the air around Miller's Crossing felt tight. It was a stillness that vibrated, like a bowstring pulled back just before the release. Sarah Miller was asleep, but her sleep was restless. She dreamed of wheels breaking and fences falling. But outside, on the wooden planks of the porch, Kele Redwolf was not asleep. He lay on his bedroll, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. But his eyes were open. He was watching the dark. He was listening to the wind. He heard it before he saw it. The soft, muffled crunch of a boot on dry gravel. Not the scuttle of a lizard or the trot of a coyote. The heavy, clumsy step of a man trying to be quiet. Kele didn't move. He didn't reach for the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall. That would be too loud. Instead, he slipped his hand beneath his blanket and gripped the handle of his knife. He rolled silently off the porch, melting into the shadows beneath the eaves of the roof he had just repaired. He smelled it then, the sharp, chemical sting of coal oil. Silas Thorne had lost his patience. The railroad man had realized that intimidation wasn't working, that the widow wasn't breaking. So he had decided to burn her out. 3 shadows detached themselves from the darkness near the barn. They carried torches, unlit for now, and heavy jugs of kerosene. They moved toward the trading post, whispering curses as they stumbled over the uneven ground. They were hired hands, rough men from the saloon who thought terrifying a woman was easy money. They didn't know that the shadow watching them had once walked through enemy lines without bending a blade of grass. The first man reached the corner of the porch. He uncorked his jug, splashing the oil against the dry wood of the siding. "Light it up," he hissed to his companion. The second man struck a match. The flame flared to life, a sudden, violent orange in the blackness. But before the match could touch the oil, a hand shot out of the dark. It was a blur of motion. Kele didn't strike like a brawler. He struck like a viper. He grabbed the wrist, holding the match, and twisted. The man yelped, a sound of pure shock, as the match fell harmlessly into the dust and sputtered out. "Who's there?" the third man shouted, fumbling for the pistol at his belt. Kele stepped into the faint light. He looked terrifying. He made no sound. He simply moved. He swept the legs out from under the second man, sending him crashing into the dirt. The third man raised his gun, his hand shaking. But Kele was already inside his guard. A swift, open palm strike to the chest knocked the wind out of him, and the gun clattered to the ground. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a dismantling. It was the difference between a man who fights for money and a man who fights for a home. Inside the house, Sarah woke with a gasp. The shout had pierced her sleep. Then came the smell kerosene and the faint, acrid smoke of the extinguished match. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to seize her throat. "They're here," her mind screamed. "They've come to finish it." For a second, she wanted to hide under the bed. She wanted to be small. But then she remembered the man on her porch. She remembered the scars on his back and the promise in his eyes. He was out there fighting for her. "No," she whispered to the dark room. "Not tonight." Sarah threw off the quilt. She didn't reach for a robe. She reached for the heavy, double-barreled shotgun that had belonged to Thomas. She broke it open, checking the shells by feel, and snapped it shut with a sound that meant business. She threw open the front door. The scene before her was chaos frozen in time. One man was groaning in the dirt. Another was scrambling backward, trying to find his footing. And Kele stood in the center of them, his chest heaving, his knife held low at his side. He wasn't attacking. He was holding the line. But from the edge of the yard, a fourth figure emerged on horseback. It was Silas Thorne, holding a lit torch. "Burn it," Thorne screamed, his polished veneer cracking into rage. "Burn it all down." Thorne threw the torch. It arched through the night sky, trailing sparks like a falling star. It landed not on the house, but on a pile of dry hay near the base of the porch. The fire roared to life instantly. Hungry and bright, Kele spun around, ready to stomp it out. But the men on the ground saw their chance. They lunged at him. "Get back." The voice was thunder. Sarah Miller stepped onto the edge of the porch, the firelight illuminating her white nightgown. and the cold steel of the shotgun leveled at Thorne's chest. "Get off my land," she screamed. And she pulled the trigger. She aimed high. Intentionally, the blast tore through the night, shredding the leaves of the cottonwood tree above Thorne's head. His horse reared, terrified by the noise and the fire, nearly unseating him. The hired men froze. They looked at the wild, terrifying strength of Kele Redwolf, and then at the furious, armed woman standing in the firelight. Their resolve crumbled. This wasn't a helpless widow. This was a fortress. "Go," one of them yelled, scrambling for the dark. But they didn't get far. The gunshot had done more than scare the horses. In the quiet of the desert, sound travels for miles, and the flash of the fire was a beacon. From the road leading to town, lights appeared, lanterns swinging in the rhythm of a gallop. "Hold it right there." Sheriff Duncan rode into the yard, his pistol drawn. Behind him were the miller's nearest neighbors, the Johnsons, the Smiths, even old Mrs. Gable in her buggy. They had seen the glow. They had heard the shot. The yard was suddenly flooded with light and people. The neighbors jumped down, grabbing horse blankets and buckets from the trough, rushing to beat out the flames, licking at the porch steps. Within moments, the fire was smothered, leaving only hissing steam and charred wood. The sheriff looked around the scene. He saw the spilled kerosene jugs. He saw the hired thugs trying to sneak away into the sagebrush, only to be blocked by Mr. Johnson and his sons. And he saw Silas Thorne, sitting on his nervous horse, his face pale in the lantern light. Then, the sheriff looked at the porch. He saw Sarah, shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, lowering the shotgun, and he saw Kele Redwolf standing beside her. The Apache drifter wasn't holding a weapon anymore. His hand was resting gently on Sarah's shoulder, steadying her. The town of Willow Creek had spent years whispering about savages. They had looked at men like Kele with suspicion and fear. But tonight, the picture was undeniable. On one side was the wealthy, civilized man from the railroad, smelling of expensive cologne and arson. On the other side was the man they called a drifter, standing as the only shield between a widow and destruction. The prejudice that had held the town in its grip seemed to evaporate in the smoke. "Well?" Sheriff Duncan said, his voice heavy with disgust as he looked up at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, it seems you have a lot of explaining to do. Arson, attempted murder, and trespassing." "She's just a stubborn woman," Thorne sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. "She's standing in the way of progress. She's standing in her home." "Mrs. Gable said from the crowd, her voice sharp. "And it looks like she's got better company than you." "Silas." The sheriff holstered his gun and walked over to Thorne's horse. "Get down," he ordered. "You're sleeping in a cell tonight." As Thorne was dragged away, shouting threats that no one listened to, the neighbors turned to the porch. They didn't look at Kele with fear. Mr. Johnson nodded to him, a respectful, man-to-man acknowledgement of a job well done. Kele didn't smile. He just nodded back, his hand never leaving Sarah's shoulder. The sun rises differently after a storm. The light feels cleaner, sharper. The next morning, the air at Miller's Crossing smelled of wet ash and coffee. The damage to the porch was ugly blackened boards and scorched paint, but the structure held. The house was still standing. The neighbors had gone home hours ago, promising to return with lumber to help repair the burns. The sheriff had taken Thorne and his men away. It was over. The siege was broken. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring into her coffee cup. Her hands were still trembling, just a little. The silence had returned. But it felt different now. It felt empty. She hadn't seen Kele since sunrise. A cold dread began to pool in her stomach. The danger was gone. The roof was fixed. The enemy was defeated. A man like Kele Redwolf, a man who walked the perimeter. A man who belonged to the road. What reason did he have to stay now? He was a warrior. And the war was over. Sarah set her cup down with a clatter. She hurried to the front door, pushing it open. There, by the hitching post, Kele's paint horse was saddled. The bedroll that had been on the porch was rolled tight and tied behind the saddle. Kele was standing by the horse, checking the cinch. Sarah's heart shattered. It was a physical pain, sharp and breathtaking. He was leaving, just as he had arrived, quietly, efficiently, without a goodbye. She walked off the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel. She tried to compose her face, tried to summon the dignity she had shown Thorne. But she couldn't. "The road calls you back?" she asked. Her voice was thin, fragile as glass. Kele froze. He didn't turn around immediately. He finished tightening the strap, gave the horse a pat on the neck, and then slowly turned to face her. He held his hat in his hands. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the shadows under her eyes, and the way she was hugging her arms around herself. "Sarah," he said softly, "I understand." She interrupted quickly, because if she didn't say it now, she would start crying. "You did what you came to do. You fixed the roof. You saved the house. You don't owe me anything. I can pay you your wages. And you can go." Kele frowned, his brow furrowed, deepening the lines of his face. He looked confused. "Go," he repeated. "Go where?" To wherever you were going before you found me," Sarah said, tears spilling over despite her best efforts. "To the road?" Kele looked at the saddlebags, then back at her. A realization dawned in his dark eyes. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing right in front of her, close enough to block out the rising sun. "The road has nothing for me, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I walked that road for 10 years. It is cold. It is lonely. And it never leads anywhere. But—" Sarah gestured helplessly to the horse. "You're packed." Kele reached out and took her hands. His grip was warm, solid, anchoring her to the earth. "I was packing the tools," he said, "and I was checking the perimeter. Thorne has friends. I wanted to make sure the trail was clear for the neighbors to come back." Sarah stared at him, hope warring with her fear. You aren't leaving." Kele shook his head. "I told you. I am not a drifter anymore." He released one of her hands and reached for his saddlebag. He undid the buckle and pulled out his bedroll. "But I am done sleeping on the porch," he said firmly. "The wood is hard, and it gets cold before dawn." He walked past her, up the scorched steps of the porch. Sarah turned, watching him, her heart beginning to beat a new rhythm, not of fear, but of profound, overwhelming joy. Kele walked through the open front door of the trading post. He didn't stop in the entryway. He walked to the row of hooks by the door, the hooks where Thomas used to hang his coat. Kele unrolled the bedroll. Not on the floor, but he placed it on the bench. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, He took his wide-brimmed hat, the hat that had shielded him from 1,000 miles of sun, and hung it on the hook. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It meant he was off the clock. It meant he wasn't watching for the next threat. It meant he was home. He turned back to Sarah, who was standing in the doorway, sunlight framing her silhouette. "Coffee?" he asked, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. Sarah laughed. It was a wet, shaky sound, but it was full of light. "Yes," she said. "Coffee." She walked into the house, closing the door against the heat, shutting out the desert and the dust. Later that morning, as the sun climbed high and bright over the Arizona territory, anyone passing by Miller's Crossing would have seen the smoke damage. Yes, but they also would have seen two figures standing by the repaired fence, looking out over the land. Not a widow and a hired hand, but a man and a woman, standing hand in hand, ready to build something new from the ashes. The wind still blew through the sagebrush, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a promise kept. And that, my friends, is the story of Sarah and Kele. I hope you enjoyed The Drifter's Promise. You know, there is something so powerful about that moment, when two people who have been battered by life decide to stop fighting the world alone and start fighting for each other instead. It reminds us that no matter how old we are, or how many scars we carry, home isn't just a place with a roof. It's the person who hangs their hat beside yours. I would love to know what you're thinking right now. Where are you listening from? Today, are you on your front porch with a cup of coffee? Are you in the kitchen, kneading dough like Sarah? Or maybe you're driving down a long, dusty road. Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your stories. If this story touched your heart, please do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps more folks find our campfire here. And if you know a friend who needs a little reminder that it's never too late for a new beginning, go ahead and share this video with them. And of course, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Dust Trail channel. We have so many more stories to tell, tales of the frontier, of courage, and of love that endures the hardest winters. Until next time, keep your heart open and keep watching the horizon. You never know who might be walking up the road to change your life. This is Dust Trail, signing off.